Hey guys, Fox here. The 2024 United Football League Draft has officially concluded, and it is time to start recapping what each team did in the draft. Remember, this draft essentially had just players who were eligible in the 2024 NFL Draft but weren't selected. They can be currently on NFL rosters, as this is essentially a player's rights draft, much like the 2023 USFL College Draft for those of you who were around the channel when that came out. So essentially, some of these players might end up coming and playing next year, some might be coming and playing in a couple years, and some might never play in this league. But if they do decide to go to the UFL, they will be required to play for the team that selected them. So we're going to be starting off with the Memphis Showboats today, as we're going to be doing these in order from the order of the draft. I'm going to be uploading probably 2 of these a day, so if you're not already and you want to see more, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. And without further ado, let's get started with the first overall pick of the entire 2024 UFL College Draft, Jason Bean, quarterback out of Kansas. This was a shocker. Look, Bean is somebody who had to come in and fill time. Kansas had some really just poor luck with their QBs, in terms of injuries over the past couple of years. And he was one of those guys that came in and did a very serviceable job. Of course, in 2023, he had a really solid 18-7 TD to interception ratio following his 14-4. And then the fact is he was really good in just yards per pass. 200 attempts basically for over 2,000 yards is 10 yards an attempt. That's really solid. This is a guy who also can run, and he is very athletic. He is currently on the Colts, but he's listed as a QB wide receiver. They think he might be able to make the roster as wide receiver. The last quarterback to play in the UFL that would go on to be a QB receiver in an NFL team? That was Alex Magoo. So this is a guy whose skill set definitely has the potential to be really good. This is essentially the Showboat saying, this is somebody who looks like a UFL QB. Now, of course, there are question marks about this selection. Case Cookus and T. Will, talent-wise, you could argue are better. Again, you can argue that. But the fact is that, while yes, in terms of, and objectively, they were 2 of the worst QBs in the league this past year, a lot of that was due to the god-awful offensive line that the Memphis Showboats had. So the question is the offensive line going to be good enough to actually make it to where if Bean decides to come to the league at some point, can he actually play behind it? Or is he just going to be sacked, 40 times in a 10-game season? It's a very questionable thing, but the fact is Bean is somebody who talent-wise definitely can be a really good QB in the UFL. It'll be interesting to see what happened. That was their first overall pick. Now with their second-round pick, they selected running back Blake Watson. This is a pick I wasn't really too upset about. Look, Darius Victor was really the only running back that got significant time last year, and again, offensive line was a huge issue. Currently, Watson is on the Denver Broncos. He was a first-team All-AAC player this past year, after some of the AAC teams had left and all that, where he ran for 455 yards in just 5 games, had a 5.9 yards per rush, had 233 yards receiving, and then in 2022, of course, had a really solid year when he was able to play a full season, 900 yards rushing, 300 yards receiving, really, really solid player. I'm not really too upset about this pick. I think this was a solid pick. Again, they didn't really get much out of the running back position outside of a couple games from Victor. Yes, a lot of that was the offensive line. But even then, you can't really, if you were to go to an average person who watched like a couple UFL games, they couldn't tell you any other running back that played on that team. So getting somebody like Watson, if he were to come to the league, definitely going to be a good, solid player for them. Interesting to see. This is a guy who did rush for 1,000 yards in college before. So, we'll see, and he also is, he just played on Memphis, and, well, he's going to be the Showboats. Solid pick. Now, the next one is Evan Anderson, defensive line, mainly defensive tackle, from the Showboats. He is currently on the 49ers. This is a guy who played 39 games for Florida Atlantic. He registered 145 tackles, 20 TFLs, 7 sacks, 2 passes deflected, and 3 fumble recoveries. This is a guy who has received some honors, 3rd team All-AAC, Conference USA, honorable mention honors and all that, 2nd team All-CUSA. Solid career at FAU. Now, again, this is one of those where we start to see some questionable selections. Yes, their defense had a lot of issues, but we're now 3 picks in and they haven't addressed their 2 biggest needs in offensive line and defensive back, mainly corner. So, this is a pick where it's a solid player, but this is one of those where it's not really filling your must-need. You're filling a need, admittedly, but not a must-need, right? This is not where your biggest issue lies, so questionable, but a solid player nonetheless. Then we have Jalen Coker, wide receiver from Holy Cross. He is currently on the Carolina Panthers. This is somebody who was a first-team All-Patriot League twice, a second-team All-Patriot League once, a first-team FCS All-American, last year in 2023. He ended up having almost 3,000 yards receiving in his career, and he was a very, very just talented guy in a lot of, numbers in a sense. He was able to run like a 1.52 second 10-yard split. He was able to have like a 42.5 inch vertical jump. Essentially, he was one of those guys that, you have the pro day combine guys. He was pretty much one of those guys. Very athletic guy. So this is somebody who has a lot of potential if he were to go to the Memphis Showboats. Though, again, we start with the things where it's a questionable pick solely in the sense of it's another receiver. Now, yes, we did see David Davis sign with the Carolina Panthers, so who knows, maybe they're doing this in a sense that they don't expect both guys to make it to the Panthers roster. Whichever one doesn't make it ends up either coming back in Davis's case or comes to in Coker's case. I think, again, this is a solid player, but this is not a pick that they needed. So, questionable. Again, not terrible, just not what you needed, so it's a very weird one. Then we have Eric Watts for their 5th round pick, defensive end out of UConn. For UConn, he was a solid player, ended up having 24 sacks across the 4 years. He was with the Jets, currently on their roster. This guy did have 10 sacks 1 year. UConn has been a football team, is the best way to describe it, the past few years. Again, this is another selection on the wrong side of the line. You're getting the defensive line some help, which, again, yes, you want to bolster that D-line, which was really just not good. But, again, wasn't your weakest point on your roster. So it's a questionable decision to, continue stockpiling there. But, again, it's a solid player, just not really a solid position that you needed as much. But, yeah. And now we have probably what many would say is their best pick of the entire draft in Andrew Rame. This is a guy that was a really solid player for Oklahoma. Again, he was at one of those big schools. He was a second-team All-Big Ten twice, center. So you finally got some offensive line. And I would argue this might be their best pick of the entire draft. This is another Carolina Panther. Just seems that Memphis has something to do with Panthers, I guess. But yeah, this is a really solid pick. I think this was a great one. This is somebody who has potential to be a really solid player for this league. Again, this is somebody who was a really solid center in a big conference like the Big 12. Played at Oklahoma, was a center that played a lot of games there naturally. That's how he was a second-team All-Big 12 twice. So this is somebody who, if he does come to the UFL, definitely can help that terrible offensive line really well. Center is very important on the offensive line. So this is a really solid pick. I think this is probably their best pick of the entire draft. And then their 7th round pick, they have Vandy Rigby, who came out of Temple, linebacker. He ended up having over 200 tackles in his career at Temple. He had, just over 4 sacks and 10 TFLs. In terms of this is a okay one. He's on Baltimore. If he ends up making the roster, that's a good sign for him being a really solid player in the future. Baltimore, their linebackers are just crazy. But I don't know if this was a great pick. Again, they are not. This is another one of those where it's like you could have used this pick for other guys that would help you in other areas on your roster instead of just picking a linebacker, which I would say most people wouldn't say is their biggest need at all. I think their D-line, which granted they drafted a couple, which is good, but mainly their DBs, and their O-line, of course. Very weird pick here. Not terrible, but pretty bad in the sense of what position you drafted and what you need. Now, their 3rd to last pick was Jaquan Shepard, cornerback out of Maryland. They finally decided to start shoring up that god-awful secondary. Now, Shepard was somebody that I watched a lot at Cincinnati. This is a very solid player. He was, with, Sauce and them, and Sauce, Kobe, and all them at, Cincinnati when they were making those runs as an AAC team. And then this past year, he went to Maryland. He was a first-team All-AAC back in 2022, along with Ivan Pace Jr., who now is a very, big mainstay in the Vikings. So, yes, we have seen UDFAs, from Cincinnati on that team become, really big stars. But overall, Shepard, this is a really good pick. This is, again, arguably their best pick. This or Rame is definitely their best pick of the draft. This is a really solid cornerback to get this late in the draft. This is somebody who, again, I've watched at Cincinnati. He was really good the 1 year they gave him a lot of time to actually play. He looked really good. This is a solid pick. I think this is definitely a really good one if he does come to the UFL. He is currently with the Raiders, so we'll see. But if he does go to the UFL and goes to the Showboats, that'll really help out the secondary. Now, their 2nd to last pick was McAllen Castles, tight end, Tennessee. This was a guy who was a really good player in the Big Sky Conference. He was a 2-time second team and 1-time first team. Now, in terms of what he did, in the Big Sky, his main 2 years were 21 and 22, where he had basically like 350 if you want to average it 350, 360 receiving yards in 12 and 11 games. Really solid there. And then Tennessee is last year in college. He ended up having 280 yards receiving. This is a good tight end. It's just you have one and Sage Surratt, and I don't know. Again, this feels like you're drafting out of if you think he's a great player, not if he's in need. Again, having a backup that could be really good is a good thing, but questionable, solid player. I know a lot of people are really happy to see him get drafted, but I think there's other teams that could have drafted him, that actually would have used him more, but still a good player, just not the best pick, again, in position. And then lastly, they have another wide receiver they picked in Mason Tipton out of Yale. So already, yes, super smart guy. This is a guy who finished third in school history in career touchdown receptions, fifth in receptions, sixth in receiving yards, three-time All-Ivy selection, first-team All-Ivy, his last year there where he had 10 TDs. Really, really good player. Again, this is somebody who was at Yale, really smart player, currently on the New Orleans Saints. This is this is another really good player. It's just, again, why? And I think that honestly is, this pick basically sums up this whole draft for the Showboats the best, and that's why. Yes, really smart player, really good player from where he played, but I don't know. Overall, though, it's a solid pick, but time to look at my draft grade for them. The draft grade I'm giving them is a D. Look, you had two glaring weaknesses, an offensive line and your defensive backs. You drafted two total players for those positions. They are good players. But the one thing you got to also note, and I know we'll talk about it more when I get to them, but the Stallions drafted multiple offensive linemen after having one of, if not the best O-line in the league. You know why you draft multiple positions in an area of need, or multiple players in a position of need? It's because in this league, a lot of these guys will not ever play in the UFL. A lot of them will, but a lot of them won't. So essentially, if you only draft one center, you're banking on him not making an NFL roster and being able to play next year. Same with, the corner you drafted, getting Shepard. It's yes, you're getting a good player, but you're having to bank on him actually, failing in the NFL. Whereas if you draft 3 or 4 of a position, you're all but guaranteed that one of those guys surely will be playing for you in a year or two. So the Showboats drafted positions like receiver twice, but they didn't really need to. So I think that overall, when you look at the Showboats draft, it was a pretty poor draft when you consider who they needed and everything. Definitely not the best. I think this is probably the worst, if not one of the worst drafts any team had, solely in an area of you didn't fix your issues at all or try to. You did a couple of minor things, and you drafted other areas you didn't really need for sure. You drafted a quarterback, but if your quarterback plays for you even as soon as next year, does it matter if your offensive line is still trash? So, again, I'm giving them a D. Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today it's time to do the second United Football League 2024 College Draft recap in the Houston Roughnecks. Like I said in the last one, we're going to be doing these based on the draft order, so today is the second one, and we are doing the Houston Roughnecks. Now, the Roughnecks are a team that finished 1-9, the worst team in the league, but because they lost the Week 10 game to the Showboats, they lost the right to the first overall pick to Memphis, so they had to pick second across the entire draft. Now, the Roughnecks have a lot they need to fix, and so we're going to be talking about it just like last time. We're going to look at each and every pick, talk about them, as well as doing an overall draft grade. Remember, I am doing 2 of these a day, so make sure to subscribe to the channel, be notified as soon as I upload any of them. And without further ado, let's get started with the second overall pick, Awabi Oki. Now, this was a pick that kind of showcased what the Roughnecks are going to do the entire draft, for the most part. Drafting players who are not currently on an NFL roster. Now, yes, some of these guys will end up being on one, but for the most part, a lot of these guys that currently aren't will have to get lucky with players getting injured, getting opportunities and all that. But the fact is, this is a guy who was not currently on a roster. He did try out with the Chiefs, didn't make the team. This is somebody who was a very highly touted prospect. Of course, if I remember the whole story correctly, it was a big deal. He was ranked higher than Micah Parsons by a lot of, news sites heading into college. But of course, it didn't last. He's with Alabama for 1 year, then he went to Houston, then UT Martin, then Michigan, then Charlotte. So this is somebody who bounced around from team to team. His best thing was being an all-AAC second-team player. He had some good stats, especially at Charlotte, but this is a guy who definitely, he still did, change teams all the time, so there's a lot of question marks about him. And the fact is that This is a weird first pick. I mean, I'll talk about in a video that'll come out like later, whether it be like next week or 2 weeks, about how the Houston Roughnecks D-line was a huge disappointment. But the fact is, it still is one of, if not the most talented defensive lines in the league. So drafting a position for the D-line is a very weird one, especially with your first pick when you have a lot of other question marks in your roster. Again, this is somebody who has a lot of talent in a sense that, heading into college, he was a very highly touted prospect. But currently not on an NFL roster. It's a weird one. So comes in as the first pick for them. Now their second pick was Trey Fluellen, and this was another one. Fluellen was another player who is not on an NFL roster. Okay, this is a guy who played at Middle Tennessee, really solid player at Middle Tennessee, safety. Ended up having almost 200 tackles. Actually did have 7.5 TFLs, is really solid. Had like 5 interceptions. Was a guy that in his last year had a lot of was heading to be a really solid player, but then he ended up tearing his ACL, and that kind of really just derailed any of his, NFL hope and all that. So this is a player I wouldn't be shocked at all to see in the UFL, but another one where it's just weird pick. Again, yes, there's a very good chance he'll be in the UFL, but you're picking a guy who is playing safety, who just is coming off a torn ACL. Very risky decision to draft a player like that. This is somebody who, yes, was somebody who was looked to be a really solid player in, the CUSA, but it's an interesting pick. I don't think this is necessarily a bad pick. Again, it kind of fits with a lot of their other picks of getting guys who have a very good likelihood of playing for the Roughnecks in the future or really next year. But again, I just don't really see this one as being a, slam dunk pick. It is a draft pick that will probably be on the team, but we'll see. Now, their third pick was Cam Stutz. This is a solid pick, I think. This is a guy who was at Auburn. He started basically every game this past year, including the Tropical Bowl. He was a starter in 2022 as well. So, for basically 2 years, he's been essentially a starting lineman for a big program in Auburn. Now, offensive line, of course, is a position that is very hard to come by in terms of good players in spring football. So, getting as many as you can is a really good thing. Of course, with the Roughnecks, saying that Mark Thompson returns and everything, and Nolan Henderson returns, you're going to need a good offensive line to have that running game be really solid, especially when you have a QB that's a dual threat. So getting your offensive line to be better is a really smart decision. So I actually like this pick a lot. I think this is somebody who definitely needed to be picked high in a sense that, this team just needed those kind of players. The Roughnecks, they needed to get offensive linemen for that reason. So this is a really solid pick. You're getting somebody who's going to help you in the trenches. Were there better offensive linemen available? You can argue that, but at the end of the day, this is a really solid pick. I think this is a good one for the third round. Now, the fourth round pick was Donovan Manuel, FIU position linebacker. Now, this is another pick that is, I actually think this is okay, but look, this is somebody who at FIU this past season ended up having like 15 TFLs, 120 total tackles, really solid linebacker in that regard. He did play at Eastern Tennessee before, where he was also a really solid player there. But this is a good pick. I mean, linebacker isn't a position that is super needed for the Roughnecks. They do have still good linebackers. Now, some of them are injured, and some of them didn't perform as well as you expected this past year. But I think that overall, this is a really solid player. I think this is definitely a good linebacker to select. I think that Manuel is going to be somebody who, in the UFL, would be really good. I mean, if you can go and play 12 college games and have 120 tackles, if you can go to the UFL and if you were to have me like 80 in a course of 10 games, that's incredible. So when you have somebody like that who's able to be like that field general, getting tackles and all that, it's a really solid pick. This is a good selection. I think this is a good one. Now, their fifth round pick is another offensive lineman in Hayden Gillum. This is a good pick as well. Again, offensive line. This is a guy who was an all Big 12 honorable mention from coaches and was a second team academic Big 12. This is twice. He was at K-State this past year and most of his career. So when you look at this, this is a good one. This one, this is a guy who, again, started basically 2 years as a starting offensive lineman for K-State. And again, it's a simple, solid pick. Again, offensive lineman, insanely important in this league. It's very hard to come by good ones. As we talked about in the Showboats video, draft recap, not all of these players are going to go to the UFL. Now, a lot of these players, so far, every player we've talked about is currently not on an NFL roster, but a lot of these guys will not play in the UFL. A lot of them will. So if you're drafting guys who have a good shot at playing in the UFL because they're not currently on an NFL roster, and then you're adding that you're drafting multiple of them, you're basically guaranteeing you're going to get at least 1 or 2 guys to actually play for you in that said position. So getting Gillum is a really solid pick in the 5th round for a second offensive lineman. Now, your 6th round was Malcolm Epps, tight end. Tight end was an area where the Roughnecks weren't terrible at. They had some issues in terms of injuries, and I think that this is a overall decent pick. That's just somebody who basically every other year was getting, some actual receptions. I mean, 20 receptions, 10 receptions, and 9 receptions. His 3 biggest seasons receiving. His last year he was ACC and Pitt, and he only had 9 receptions, but he had 115 yards. Again, it's not always about receiving. Again, as we talked about heading into the season with the Roughnecks, they needed tight ends that were better at blocking than necessarily pass catching. So adding somebody else, another tight end to that room, not necessarily a bad selection. There's other areas in the team you could argue they needed to work on more, but I think this is a solid pick. This is a good one for the Roughnecks. Now, their 7th round pick was Xavier Benson. Benson is another linebacker selection, this one coming from Oklahoma State. Now, Benson was really solid at OSU. Now, again, it's not like he had, as many overall tackles, but he was playing, in the Big 12, overall really, a much bigger conference and all that. He was a really good player for them. 65 tackles, 76 tackles the, last 2 years in college, and even at Texas Tech, in between, before his junior college stint, he had a decent year. Then he was at junior college where he was also really good there. So I think this is a really solid pick. Again, this is another guy that essentially he was in college for a very long time. I mean, when you were in college in 2018 and you're just coming out, yeah, I'm sorry, but unless you're like, a quarterback, you're really not going to get an NFL shot to most people's eyes. So this is a player that's actually a perfect fit for the UFL. Somebody who, was in college for a huge amount of time and now is, going to try and prove that, hey, it's not just a college player, that he can play in the pro level. So again, odds of him playing in the UFL next year, very high. This is a solid pick for that reason. Again, it's another linebacker, which is questionable, but I think this is a solid pick, all things considered. Good pick. Now, their 8th round pick was Rashad Williams, cornerback from Texas Tech. The first player that is at this moment on an NFL roster, that being the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, Williams was in college also from 2018, another one of those, again, why you would DFA, because he was in college since 2018. Now, this is somebody who was at UCLA and Texas Tech, so he was at big schools his entire career in college. And of course, he was, somebody who did play in a lot of games. And, he did have, almost 40 tackles a couple times. But in terms of interceptions, he only had 1. Again, odds of him going to the UFL all determined on if he makes the roster for the Raiders. But I think, again, cornerback, that's an area where the Roughnecks did need some help in. So I think this is a good pick to try and help that area. So I think this is a solid pick. Again, not much to say. Good pick. Now, the 9th round pick, Malik Dunlap, another corner. Again, you're trying to shore up that area. If you have an issue somewhere, draft 2 guys for that position. At least one should show up. Again, this is a guy that's not on an NFL roster. Another cornerback that played in college from 2018, so a long time ago. 6-year college career. It's a very long time. And again, this guy played at, North Carolina State and Texas Tech. So again, 2 big schools. So probably be on your roster. Really solid. Had 3 interceptions last year. Just talent-wise, again, I mean, this is basically the Roughnecks draft, right? They're essentially saying we're going to draft guys that have a better chance at playing for us than guys who are necessarily more talented, right? We've seen other teams that drafted guys who have very real shots of making NFL rosters, or guys who just simply put are, more talented in college. But the Roughnecks they're basically saying we're going to take slightly less talented players who have a better likelihood of playing for the team, is kind of how I feel their draft is. So, and this is kind of another one of those selections. Then the last one was Jerkarius Spivey. Spivey played at Miss State. Again, they're doubling down in tight end, getting another tight end. He appeared in 52 games, and then 27 of those games and 5 of those of the starts were at Mississippi State. He's also played at TCU. He ended up having like 300 yards in his career and all that. So, overall, another tight end that is probably going to be more of a blocker tight end and all that, but we'll see exactly what happens. Just another tight end selection for the Houston Roughnecks as their last pick. Now, my draft grade for them is going to be a C-. I don't think they were as bad as the Showboats, but I think they're only a bit better. You didn't draft a quarterback, okay? Your 2 quarterbacks that played most of the season were 2 of the worst QBs in the league, in Sinet and Henderson, I apologize, and Garantano. Henderson looked really solid, but he only had limited game action, right? He only basically played like a couple games. So you didn't draft a quarterback despite you desperately needing one. You didn't really get another running back, which I think you honestly probably should have. I think this team should have gotten another running back. And I honestly wouldn't have been upset with them drafting receivers. Again, they had multiple receivers that didn't work out the way they expected. Isaiah Henney, you can argue exactly what went wrong, but at the end of the day, the fact is it went wrong. And so there's a couple areas where he definitely took some hits. And so While I like that they're doubling down, and I like the strategy of getting players that have a high likelihood of playing for the team, I think that when you look at it as an all things considered standpoint, I don't think they did that good a draft. I think that they kind of went in a hope these guys play for us and are better than, them not making NFL rosters. I mean, it's just, I don't think it was that good a draft. I think it was a pretty poor draft, all things considered. I think that doubling down in the positions they did, yes, it's smart to double down, but you probably should have doubled down in different positions than what you decided to. Tight end doubling down is weird. Doubling down on like D line or linebacker is a bit odd, but we'll see. I'm giving him a C-. Hey guys, Zom Fox here, and today it is time to do the third UFL 2024 College Draft review or recap, and today we're going to be doing the Arlington Renegades. Now, the Arlington Renegades were a weird team. Essentially, through the first 6 games of the season, they had a lot of very close, tightly contested games, but kind of blew it in the end. Then the final 4 weeks of the season, they were one of the best teams in the league, going 3-1, with their only loss being to a team that would go to the championship game. So the Renegades are a weird team. There's question marks on whether or not their head coach is going to return or if their QB is going to return. But they had a lot of talent overall, but a lot of issues on defense and O-line. So they had a lot of work that needed to be done. So again, we still have 5 more draft recaps coming out after this one, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel with the bell on so you'll be notified as soon as I upload those. As naturally, later today we'll have the defenders come out as well. So without further ado, let's get started with the first round pick and the 3rd overall pick in John Plumlee, quarterback out of UCF. This one is a clear Luis Perez potential replacement pick. Yes, he currently is on the Steelers. He was with both Ole Miss and UCF. UCF, he had a couple good stints there, all in all. I mean, it's one of those where it's like, this is a QB pick that I just feel a lot of people agree is one of those where it is in a we don't know for sure if Luis Perez is coming back kind of pick. Because picking a QB first round when you have a guy who is unarguably a top 2 QB in the league seems wild unless you don't fully believe he's going to return. Now, John Plumlee, he was the 2 seasons he was at UCF. Statistically, he had some really solid numbers overall, over 60 completion percentage, 15-ish TDs to 8 interceptions. Could be better, but not terrible, and he is a dual threat kind of guy. Did have a season in his first year with Ole Miss where he ran for 1,000 yards. Then he was able to run for over 500 both previous years in UCF. And overall, when you look at QBs taken, this is not a bad one. So I understand the pick if you're saying that Luis Perez is not going to be back, and that's kind of what this one feels like. Again, Lindsey Scott Jr. also kind of felt like that. As we talked about it in hindsight, that was a terrible pick in their, drafts where they decided to, draft a QB and then ended up not playing him. And it felt like even then that one was kind of like we don't know for sure if Perez is coming back, and this one feels like that as well. Now, if he does come back, this pick ends up being still good if he ends up being in the NFL for this year, and then in 2026 he can come to the UFL. But overall, I actually think this is an okay pick. I think it's a solid one. You're getting a replacement. I think it would have been better served to draft a QB later in the draft, but you still got a guy that you clearly did want if you drafted him this early. So it is what it is. Now, their second round pick, they picked Griffin McDowell, an offensive tackle out of Chattanooga. Solid pick. Look, the O-line for the Renegades was not that great. Luis Perez was able to do what Case Cookus and T-Will weren't able to do, which is play around his poor O-line. Whereas guys like Cookus and T-Will would only have a couple of drives where they actually realized, hey, we should throw the ball out quickly. Perez, whenever he saw his O-line wasn't playing well, was able to kind of, move around that and do other things, short passes, quick passes, or was able to do deep shots, when the time came for it and all that. And it was a huge reason to why Perez, despite having one of the worst O-lines in the league, really only had a game and a half where he wasn't that good. That was the Roughnecks game in the first half of the Week 10 game. But as for Griffin McDowell, this is a guy who was at, Chattanooga and Florida. He played in a bunch of games. Overall, is a solid player and is currently on the Kansas City Chiefs. So this is one of those guys who, is not guaranteed to play in the UFL this next season or even has a huge shot, but we'll see if he makes the team and all that. Again, this is a solid player to get for sure. When you talk about this guy, this was somebody who was a really solid alignment on a really good team and all that in terms of their O-line. So I think this is a solid pick. Again, O-line was one of the weaknesses of Arlington, so getting offensive linemen is huge. We've talked about it every time, and I'm going to keep talking about it. O-line is the best position to draft because it's so hard to get good O-linemen in spring football. And if you're able to draft multiple guys, you're basically guaranteeing that at least one of them will come to the team sooner than later, especially since some of these players will always be in the NFL and they won't ever go to the UFL. So this is only the first offensive lineman pick they had. Now their third round pick was Kellen DeLoach, and this is a guy who is currently on the Buccaneers and is a linebacker. Now the Renegades' biggest issue on defense was really their mainly front seven, but really their front four. But their front seven was pretty poor. I mean, it was a poor defense. So solid pick in that regard. D-line is definitely their bigger weakness, but it still is a good pick. The fact is he was a first-team All-ACC back in 2023. This is somebody who has had, over 60 tackles all 3 previous years at FSU. This past year, FSU was a really good team. Injuries happened. Debatably should have been in the college football playoffs. Debatably shouldn't have, which they ended up not being in. The fact is this is somebody who was on that team, so this is somebody who has been on a team that was winning a lot. And all in all, I like this pick. You got a good linebacker. I think this is a solid one if he does come to the league. Now, their next one was Popo Amawayev. I hope I didn't butcher that name. But as for Popo, he is currently on the Carolina Panthers. He's a defensive tackle/nose tackle. He was playing at Oregon his whole college career back from 2018. And when you look at him overall, I mean, this is, again, what you need. Your D-line was bad, okay? When you signed Henri St. Amour and gave him playing time, the D-line just looked so much better. The fact is, if one guy can make that impact, if you were to get like 2 or 3 guys that are even remotely as good as him, then your D-line might not be terrible. So when you look at him, I mean, Popo this last season in college had 3 sacks. He had 3 TFLs, 18 tackles as a nose tackle, DT. So I like this pick. If he does come to the league, he's going to help you out. Major weakness, and this is a guy that can fill that. Good pick. Now, their next pick in the 5th round was Amari Gaynor, currently on the Raiders, linebacker out of UNC. He also played at FSU before 2023's last year in college football. He was with UNC. Now, in terms of what he did statistically, he didn't do much despite being a linebacker, only 27 tackles, but he had 6 TFLs and 2.5 sacks, which is really solid. So, again, you're picking another linebacker. As we talk about, double dipping is a must in these drafts. For the most part, you have to double dip because you need to guarantee you'll get at least one of these guys sooner than later. If you draft one guy at a position, the odds of him actually playing in the UFL, if he's currently on an NFL roster, are not high, especially at first year he gets drafted, which would be 2025 naturally when he would play. So if you're able to draft 2 guys, the odds of at least one of them being out of football in the NFL and having to go to the UFL are huge. So it's what you do. So double dipping at linebacker, solid. Definitely a solid pick for that regard. Now, their next pick was Bo Richter, called running back on the post, but they corrected it on their overall one. He is a linebacker out of Air Force, and he is currently on the Minnesota Vikings. Now, at Air Force, this is somebody who last season was a really solid player. This is more like an outside linebacker or a pass rusher, so again, helps that D-line. His last year at Air Force was really solid. He had double-digit sacks, almost hit 20 TFLs, had 45 total tackles. This is somebody who, if he does go to the UFL, will be really solid there. This is somebody who definitely has that potential to be a really, really good pass rusher. And when you have somebody like that on a team that, desperately needs it, that would be really good. So if he does come to the UFL, he can be a huge asset to the Renegades. Again, he has a position of need, the D-line. Outside linebacker, basically a D lineman. So really solid pick, definitely one of the better ones they've had. And then we have Taki Taimani. Again, hope I didn't butcher that name. And again, another guy currently on the Vikings. If you draft multiple D linemen from the same NFL roster, the odds of them both making the roster, like the 53-man roster, are slim. So, I mean, hey, not a bad decision. And yes, so what he did out of Oregon and Washington, the 2 places he played, were overall solid. He wasn't, a statistical dominator, but again, he had 20 tackles his last year at Oregon, had 1.5 TFLs, did not record any sack in college, but still, another D lineman currently on an NFL team. And again, it's a D lineman where it's from the Vikings. You just talked about one with Bo Richter. If one of them gets released and not picked up somewhere, you have a good shot that one of them is going to come to the team. Again, another defensive line pick, a position of need, good selection. Now, their 8th round pick, we have Spencer Rollin, offensive lineman out of UNC. Another UNC player also was at Harvard, so again, another really smart player. He didn't really see any action as a freshman, but overall, when you look at what he did in UNC, he did play a decent amount of games for UNC. And of course, this past season, with Amari on Hampton, they were able to get a really solid ground game going and all that. So all in all, I think this is a really solid player to get selected again. It's another offensive lineman. Look, the team needs O-linemen, so again, you're double dipping in that O-line now. So you're hoping that one of them ends up coming to the team. So again, a really solid selection here with Rollin. Then we have their second to last pick in Bryson Mays, center out of Southern Miss. Again, another offensive lineman, another, drafting position of need. Really solid selection. Currently, he is on the 49ers. He did appear in 41 games and started 31 games in his 5 seasons at Southern Miss in West Virginia. Now, he was a redshirt senior in 2023. He appeared in 6 games. And overall, they were a really decent running team. The Golden Eagles, averaged 162 yards a game, which was 6th in the conference, so not insane, but not terrible. But really, when you look at him, it's the fact that, again, you have a player who is another offensive lineman, has a good shot of, playing in the UFL at some point because you've drafted now 3 of them. So you're hoping he ends up coming to the league at some point, and if he does, he's going to help you out immensely in that O-line. So a really solid pick, all things considered. Definitely a solid one. Now, their last pick was Drake Stoops, wide receiver out of Oklahoma. Is it really shocking? I mean, they drafted Bob Stoops' kid. Now, first of all, that does bring a lot of hope that Stoops will be returning. He was one of the ones that had the biggest question mark on whether or not he will be back next year. So this selection makes it seem more likely that he will be back next year. Now, as for Stoops, he is currently on the Rams. He was a first-team All-Big 12 in 2023. And he did have a really solid season that last year. He had 962 yards and 84 receptions. He had 10 TDs, all career highs for him in college football. So, definitely a solid pick in that regard. Now, of course, this is definitely a pick of, it's Drake Stoops. It's like the Lakers picking Bronny James, right? You picked him because of who he is in relation to somebody on the team, not necessarily because he deserved to be picked in that area. The fact is, this was the 10th round. The odds that Stoops would have been drafted by one of the other teams, I think, is pretty low. It's not a guarantee that he wouldn't be, but, come on. If he made it 10 rounds, he probably wasn't going to be picked, and he would have been able to just sign the Renegades. So, I actually think it's an okay pick. It's just that wide receiver is not your biggest area of concern. The Renegades had a lot of really talented receivers that played really well this year. So, I really don't think receiver was a position of need. So, in that regard, I would have to argue this might be the worst pick they had in the entire draft just for that reason. Again, I think it would be really cool to see him, play for Bob Stoops if he doesn't, make it in the NFL. It's just, again, kind of weird. Is what it is. Now, my draft grade for them is an A-. I think they had a really good draft. Look, I think it's hard to really fault them in anything. Now, why are they not an A or an A+ in that regard? Well, it's honestly because I think they picked a QB too high, and I think because of the Drake Stoops pick, I'm going to be honest. I think they should have focused a bit more on that defense. Again, the defense was really poor this past season. I like how many D linemen they got, but they only got one true linebacker. They didn't get anyone to help shore up the secondary in any regard. And then when you look at their O-line, solid. I think they picked a decent amount of guys there. But I think you could have gotten a QB later in the second or third round, try to get a better offensive lineman or D lineman early in the draft, especially with the 3rd overall pick. It feels like they're once again overvaluing QB when they don't necessarily need a QB. They might need a QB, but they don't need a QB for sure unless, they've heard stuff we haven't heard, which is Luis Perez is going to retire. So it's just one of those where it feels really weird that you decided that, again, the biggest mistake you made heading into the 2024 season was you picked a QB too high, and now you're doing it again. And then again, the Drake Stoops pick, I would have preferred to see another D lineman. I would have preferred to see a linebacker. I would have preferred to see a DB. Again, still a really solid draft. Because again, I don't really think the receiver or QB picks are bad. It's just that, the players aren't bad. It's just that the position isn't what you should have drafted. But even then, it's not really much to, be upset about. They had a lot of needs. They focused on those needs. They did the opposite of the Showboats. The Showboats drafted one center and called it a day. The Showboats had an even worse O-line than the Renegades. The Renegades did far more to work on it. So all in all, Renegades get an A-. Really, really good draft for them. Definitely deserve it. Hey guys, Zom Fox here, and today it's time to do the 4th UFL draft recap from the 2024 UFL College Draft. And today we're doing the DC Defenders. Yes, the best team record-wise to not make the playoffs, and it's time to look at them. Now, despite the fact that they were technically the closest team to missing the playoffs, everybody kind of agrees the Renegades were a better team than them. And the fact that the Defenders have a lot more issues on their roster than even Arlington did. DC had a lot of issues with their defense not being as good as we expected. Of course, with Amon Smith's injury, their running back position just completely tanked. Questions about their QB position since they decided to never bench Te'amu and let anyone else play, so they don't even know who they have really. And of course, their wide receiver room being pretty poor outside of really just one good receiver this past year. So there's a lot to work for. So it's time to recap their draft. Again, I still have all 4 of the playoff teams draft recaps, which will be coming out in the next 2 days. So make sure you're subscribed with the bell on and be notified for that. And without further ado, let's get started with the first round pick and the 4th overall pick, Gottlieb Aidze. I hope I didn't butcher that name. Now, as for Gottlieb, he is an offensive lineman, offensive tackle, being picked 4th overall. This is a bold selection, which I'm actually not against. Again, offensive line, huge importance. As I've always said, hard to come by, hard to get good ones, all of that. He is currently on the Eagles. He played 5 seasons at Maryland and Frostburg State, and he appeared in 48 total games. He was a 3-time first-team All-Mountain East Conference selection at Frostburg, and then at Maryland, he helped make, that team end up having some really solid numbers, especially with Talia Tagovailoa. So all in all, when I look at this, I think this is a solid selection. I mean, you're getting an offensive tackle who was a really solid player. Granted, it's not in, one of the biggest conferences in the world, but he was one of the better players at All-Mountain East. And then when you look at it all in all, again, you're drafting offensive linemen very early, and you're hoping that, if he does come to the league, he's going to help you out. If he does come to the UFL, it's going to be a huge help to that offensive line. And so I think that all in all, this is a really solid pick. You really can't be upset about drafting an offensive lineman in the first round when you're talking about the UFL. Because you're saying, let's get a player that's going to help us out if he comes to the league for sure, rather than getting like a QB who might help you out, might not if he starts or not. So I really like this selection, definitely a good one. Now, speaking of QB, their 2nd round pick was Caden Slovis. Now, we'll get to the really weird pick later, but with this one, this is picking a QB who played at USC, Pittsburgh, and BYU to varying degrees of success across the teams. In a statistical sense, he was never truly insane outside of his first year in USC, where he had 3,500 yards on like an absurd 72 completion percentage, 30 TDs and 9 interceptions. He pretty much was on a somewhat downward spiral pretty much every year after that. He did rebound after a season at Pitt where he threw 9 interceptions to throw only 6 while throwing 2 more TDs. But other stats, he fell off. Now, again, in 2019 and 20, he had some really good numbers. He was a Pac-12 Freshman of the Year, and then a Pac-12 South Champion in 2020. He was a first-team All-Pac-12 in 2020 in that 6-game season, which is why those numbers are a bit lower, but still really good. So, after that second year in USC, it kind of just went down a little bit. Of course, you had the whole Caleb Williams thing, with Caleb Williams coming to USC, and he kind of got the short end of the stick there. But with Pitt and BYU, he was never able to be the same level of dominant that he was at USC. Now, as for him, he is somebody who, again, would be a potentially really good QB in the UFL. Somebody who has put up numbers that are really solid. But, of course, the question is, does he come to the league? And, of course, is the question of why. The thing with the defenders is that I said for weeks at the end of the year they needed to bench Te'amu to see what they have in their backups. The fact is they never gave McClendon or Francois true time to see what they had. So now they're kind of thinking, well, if Te'amu does retire or decides not to return to the UFL, we need another QB. But you don't really know what you have in the 2 guys that you should have played more. So now you're kind of having to worry, and so you're stuck drafting a QB in the first round. It's kind of similar to Arlington, but the difference with Arlington was their QB was actually, incredible, whereas Te'amu really wasn't that good this past year. But interesting pick. I think they had issues that they should have focused on with this pick, but it is what it is. Now, their 3rd round pick was Leonard Taylor, defensive tackle out of Miami. He was with Miami the past 3 years, and that's it. Of course, he left Miami and some NIL money to go play for the Jets. He's currently a UDFA. His sophomore year was his best year in terms of stats, 10 TFLs, 3 sacks. But this is somebody who clearly wants to play pro ball. You don't just leave college football nowadays with the whole NIL thing, especially at a bigger school like Miami, just to, say, hey, I'm just going to go be a UDFA. No, you're trying to be a pro baller. So this is somebody who definitely could be in the UFL at some point, but I think this is a solid pick. Again, the defense for the defenders was kind of a massive disappointment this past year. Now, I'm not saying we expected it to be, the best thing ever, but we expected it to be better than one of the worst units in the league. You know what I mean? So, definitely a position of need and really anywhere on defense, but especially the D-line, which was not as good as we expected it to be. So, a solid selection there. Now their fourth round pick was Garrett Greenfield, tackle out of SDSU, San Diego State University. Now with him, he is somebody who was a really good player at SDSU. Of course, they dominate FCS. I mean, they won the past 2 FCS championships. He was a 3-time first team All FCS All-American, a 3-time first All MF or MVFC. So this is a guy who was really good in that conference. Now, of course, when talking about players from SDSU, it's one of those where it's a question mark of exactly how good are they really. Sometimes we've seen guys come out of there and be incredible. Sometimes we've seen them kind of be, inflated by playing in a lower conference, or not even conference, but just a lower league in a sense, in FCS instead of FBS. But this is somebody who, at least in that level, was dominant. So you would hope that it would transfer to the UFL if he does go to the UFL, if he doesn't make it with the Seahawks or another team. So if he does come to the league, again, really good pick here. This is a lineman who can be a huge presence for you and a great player for you. I mean, huge guy, 6'7", 320. So I like this pick a lot if he does come to the league. Definitely a really good one. Definitely gets my seal of approval. Now, their 5th round pick was Braden McGregor, another defensive lineman, this time a defensive end out of Michigan. This was somebody who coming into college was a huge deal. This is a guy who was the 32nd overall ranked player in ESPN's top 300 back in 2020. Again, he only was in college football for, 4 years. In the 3 years that he played and all that, he put up, better numbers year after year, going from, 5 total tackles to 17 to 26, went from 1 TFL to 5 to 9, 0 sacks, 2.5, 4.5. So he's gotten better and better, and he's also on the Jets. Again, we've talked about it before. When you double dip on a team specifically with players who have guys in the roster, the odds that they both make it to the team are low. So, you don't wish bad on anybody. When you have Leonard Taylor and McGregor both on the Jets, both defensive linemen, the odds that both of them make the final 53-man roster and practice squad are lower than just one of them. And if they don't make the roster, the chance they play for you in the UFL are bigger, so it's a solid selection, definitely a good one. Now, their 6th round pick is Michael Wiley, running back, out of Arizona. Now, running back was a huge need this past year. When Abram Smith went down, they tried to act as if they had guys that were good enough to fill that gap. They did not. No one else really played all that well for them, so not good. Now, as for Wiley, he's currently on the Commanders. He did play at Arizona for a few years, from 19 to 2023. His best season was his junior year, where he put up 770 yards and 8 TDs on the ground, as well as 350 yards through the air and 3 TDs. So 11 total TDs and 1,100 scrimmage yards. Now, aside from that, he never really did all that much. His highest season afterward was only 300 yards, and that was a 4.4 yards per carry. But again, running back is a huge position to need. So if you do get a running back, if you need a running back, you got to draft one. So I think this is a solid pick overall, because again, it's a position that you really desperately need somebody to, help you out on. So if he comes to the UFL, it'll help you out. Solid pick. Now, Dallas Gant, linebacker out of Toledo, is their 7th round pick. He is currently on the Vikings, a 2-time first team All-MAC player, as he played in both Ohio State and Toledo, with Toledo being where he was first team All-MAC naturally. But he also played at Ohio State, where he didn't do a ton there, but then he saw a lot more action in Toledo, and back-to-back years had 116 tackles and had over 5 TFLs both years. As we talked about before, it doesn't matter really what division or league in college you're playing. If you're able to have 100 tackles in college football in 14 games, in theory, if you were to go to the UFL and get the same game time, you would hope that you'd have at least 70-plus tackles, which would be huge for a good player. So I think that getting him in the 7th round is a really solid selection. I think it's a pretty late one, and again, it helps you out in a position of need in the overall defense. So I like this pick. Really solid one for getting him this late especially. Now, Curtis Jacobs, linebacker out of Penn State. Another linebacker, again, double dipping on position. Smart move. He is currently playing with the Chiefs. He was at Penn State all 4 years of college. A simple, almost normal 4 years, though he had, COVID stuff made it a bit weird. But point is, he also was really solid. Now, he was more of an outside linebacker-ish type player. His last 3 years, he had 3, 4, and 2.5 sacks, 7, 7.5, and 9 TFLs. We never had more than 61 overall tackles. Again, this is somebody that's going to help you out a lot. Again, your D-line was not great this past year, so if he does come to the UFL in the future, he'll help you out. Again, a really good selection here. And now we have Tanner Mordecai with the WTF pick of the entire draft. You already drafted a quarterback. You already have a quarterback that a lot of people believe could be a franchise QB in the UFL in Jalen McClendon. Yet you drafted another quarterback. This one is out of Wisconsin. He also played at Oklahoma and SMU. Now, his 2 years at SMU were his best overall 2 years. Of course, 36 and 3,500 yards respectively. Both over 65 or at 65 completion percentage. Really solid TD to interception numbers. Has some rushing ability. Wisconsin naturally wasn't as good as he was in SMU, obviously, competition and all that. Did have a decent amount less attempts all in all, but his overall average was only 6.6 to 8. TD interception ratio not as good, 9 to 4. Though he did have 300 rushing yards, which is his best of his career. But the point is, why did you draft this guy? Okay, like why? Yes, he was a second-team All-AAC player in 2021, but the point is that you already drafted a quarterback. You still have a quarterback that could come back in Te'amu, and you still have QBs that many people think are good, especially with McClendon. This is quite arguably the worst pick of the entire draft for that reason. This is one of those where, again, if you're going to double dip at a position on offense, running back, wide receiver, those two areas your team desperately needed, and you haven't drafted a receiver up until this point, and spoiler alert to their last pick, they didn't draft one at all. So despite their wide receiver position being pretty bare bones, and I mean, I don't want to be that guy, but I said it as soon as, I did my wide receiver rankings. I was like, man, this DC wide receiving group is not that good. And they ended up being not that good. They had one really solid player. Kelvin Harmon was a beast, but aside from him, once he got hurt, you saw just how not that good the receiving room was. So this selection was bad. I mean, no offense to Mordecai, but this was a waste of a selection, okay? Again, if you're going to double dip somewhere else, okay? We've seen teams like Michigan be able to play 4 different QBs and have success. You know why? Because they have a roster that as a whole, as a collective, is good. DC does not have that. So instead of focusing on the roster, they're focusing on QB. This is kind of like Memphis where they only drafted 1 O-lineman. You're not fixing your team's core issue. So you're just going to have issues no matter who else you have. So this was a bad selection. Now, their last pick was Amar Brown, safety, currently on the Broncos. Played at Nebraska, back before being in Nebraska. Was like a first-team FCS All-American at Northern Iowa. He was a beast at Northern Iowa, in that FCS area or division. Now, his last year in Nebraska, where he actually saw a decent amount of playing time, he had 51 total tackles, 3 TFLs, and 1 interception. So a really solid player there again. I like this selection. You're deciding to get one guy for your back end if he decides to come to the league. This is a good decision. I like this pick. Definitely a lot better than the last one. Now, their overall draft grade is a B. This B is heavily influenced by the Mordecai selection. Look, when you compare it to the Renegades draft, the Renegades did it better. Okay? The DC draft, the decision to not draft a wide receiver, let me be honest, this B is very generous. If you were to give them like a C+, I wouldn't be upset at you. Because you didn't focus on receiver, which you desperately needed to do. You only got 1 running back, which would be excusable if you had double-dipped at wide receiver. But no, you double-dipped at quarterback? I don't know, man. This draft could have been a lot better. It could have been a lot worse. I think they got a couple really good selections at where they did. Again, I think getting Gant in the 7th round was a really solid selection. I think that getting Garrett Greenfield in the 4th round was a really good selection. But aside from those two, I mean, it's more or less this. It's just the Mordecai pick is so stupid. I mean, who knows? Because even if you want to say, oh, that could age poorly if Mordecai comes, the only way that ages poorly is if both QBs play on the team and Mordecai's better. Okay? The fact is that it is a selection that does not make sense. Okay? You picked a quarterback near the end of the draft, so again, the odds he would have been available to you as a free agent are decently high. So instead, you just said, nah, let's draft him so we can have a replacement to Te'amu. But again, if you don't have receivers to throw to, if you don't have running backs to hand off to, what good does a QB make? At least with Memphis, they have pass catchers. You can't say that with DC. You can say they have a great pass catcher and a couple guys who are streaky, but catchers, not really. Poor decision in Mordecai. But there are other really good picks make it higher than a C+ and a B- for me. Because I think that Gant and Greenfield, for when they selected them and how overall talented they are, were really good picks. So with that, I give them a B. Hey guys, Fox here, and today we're going to be starting the playoff team draft recaps from the 2024 UFL College Draft. And with that, we're starting with the St. Louis Battlehawks, who had the best selection of the 4 that made the playoffs, with the 5th overall pick. Now, the Battlehawks as a team, well, really like most of these teams that made the playoffs, really don't have any position that was truly terrible. Every position was at worst decent to at best incredible. Now, it's mainly about getting good talent and guys that kind of just make your areas better, necessarily than fixing weaknesses. This is not like the Renegades needing to draft D linemen or the Showboats needing to draft O linemen. So, like always, if you end up enjoying this video or you want to be notified as soon as I upload the other three, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. And without further ado, let's get started with the 5th overall pick in Chevan Cordeiro. I get this selection. This is you drafting somebody for the question of if AJ doesn't return. Again, both DC and Arlington did this. DC to a terrible extent, but they both did the same thing. Drafting a quarterback because you don't know for sure if your QB is going to return. Now, with Cordeiro, he was at San Jose State. He was a first-team All-Mountain West and a second-team All-Mountain West both years at San Jose State. Now, in terms of what he did, he went basically like around 7-5, 7-6 as a starter, but overall put up really solid numbers. Okay, 23 TDs to 6 interceptions, 20 TDs to 4 interceptions. Decent ground game as well, with decent TDs as well on there, 9 and 3. And then when you look at his time with Hawaii and the Rainbow Warriors, which was, before San Jose State. He put up some decent numbers his last 2 years, but at San Jose, he was a much better QB there. Again, it's understandable why you make this selection, okay? You did see Manny Wilkins play. You see that he has potential, but that his passing game did leave a lot to be desired. It still showed flashes that he could be a really dominant QB if he were to get that under control. But again, this is a really solid selection in the sense that if you don't know for sure when AJ is gone, will he play one more year? Will he not? We don't know. And especially since Cordeiro is currently not on an NFL roster, this is somebody who could very well play for this team as soon as this upcoming season. So when you look at that, I think this is a solid selection for a QB. So I think it's a good one. Now, their second round pick was Cody Schrader. Now, running back actually was really solid for the Battlehawks. So you kind of expect it to not be all that good, but it ended up being really good. Now, they did lose one of their running backs to the NFL already. And, of course, Mateo Duran is coming off an injury, so you always want to be prepared, and this is being prepared. Essentially, you now have a running back who either will return to you having been in the NFL or one who will come to you in Schrader, from your college draft. So I think that all in all, this is a solid selection. You're making sure that, you still have a decent running back. Again, you're kind of double dipping in this sense as you have a running back that was really good that is now currently in the NFL that might return, and then you have one that also might come to the league as well. Now, as for Schrader, he was a Bullsworth Trophy winner, which, is for like the walk-on, best walk-on player, consensus All-American, first-team All-SEC, 1,600 yards on the ground with Missouri, really solid numbers, 14 TDs on near 6 yards per attempt. His last year at Truman, he had 2,000 yards, 25 TDs. So this is somebody who has been really solid in every level. It's just that, again, walk-ons are not always, the most sought-after players all the time for, whatever reason you want to say, mainly because they're not highly recruited from the start. But we have seen walk-ons go on and have success in the NFL. But again, a running back that has been in college football since 2018, who has had a decent amount of wear and tear, but still young, only 24. We'll see what happens. I like this pick. Again, you want to make sure that you have a running back at some point that is good. So now you have a running back where you're hoping he recovers from injury, a running back that might return to you, and a running back that might join your team. Solid. Now, their third round pick was Feldarius Payne, defensive lineman. Now, he just recently got cut from Houston as of like 2 days ago when this video comes out, I believe. Now, he did play in Nebraska and Virginia Tech. Last year at Virginia Tech, he put up some solid numbers, 4 sacks, 10 TFLs. But again, this is somebody who was just released by an NFL team. Will he re-sign? Maybe. If not, he's going to help you out. Again, you're just shoring up your defense. Solid selection, can't be mad about it. Now, the next one was an offensive lineman in Bradley Ashmore out of Vanderbilt. He overall played, at least 8 games every year. There's not really much to say. You picked an offensive lineman. It's a solid selection. Right before this, if I'm not mistaken, is when DC picked Greenfield. So, you kind of couldn't get that one, but this is still a really solid pick all in all. Definitely not much to be upset about. Solid selection. Now, their 5th round pick was Carl Jones Jr., linebacker, currently playing for the Chicago, but out of UCLA. He was with UCLA ever since 2019, and he's overall been about the same player every year. 20-plus tackles, 3-ish TFLs or more, and like 1 to 2 sacks every year. Somebody who's been very consistent. Now, of course, his last year he did a bit better tackle-wise, But again, somebody who's been that OLB that has been really solid for every year of college football. So if he goes to the UFL, he's going to help your pass rush out. You can't be mad about that. Again, not much to say, but a really solid pick all in all. Now, their 6th round pick was Isaiah Coe out of Oklahoma, defensive tackle. Now, the 3 years at Oklahoma, he put up decent numbers. Mainly his 2nd year there, he put up 8 sacks, or 8 TFLs, which is his best season. He was also a junior college player and all that. But all in all, again, you're shoring up your D-line. It's always a good decision to shore up your lines, both of them, as they're both pretty hard to get super talent. Your D-line was already a decent unit, but I mean, your linebackers were really where you really were good at. So I understand getting some help on the D-line. So again, another solid pick, not much to say. Now, Jelani Baker, wide receiver out of Limestone. Now, this is one that a lot of people were kind of happy about. I mean, some were shocked, but in a good way. This guy had over 1,000 yards at Limestone. He wasn't playing at one of the major schools, but again, this is somebody who is currently not on an NFL roster and really fits the UFL mold really well. Being overseen in college, goes to the UFL, has a good season, possibly some upcoming year plays for them. This feels like a selection that was made entirely because it's all but guaranteed he's going to play for the UFL next year. Now, I'm not saying it's 100%, but there's a high likelihood he will be in the UFL, which means he will be on the Battlehawks next year. And again, the Battlehawks, they had a lot of great receivers. They will have a lot of great receivers next year, but they didn't really use them all that well because of their OC not really being a good OC. But this is somebody who can be a really good threat for the team. So I like this pick a lot for that reason, even though it's not really a position you needed to draft at all. But it's one of those where you kind of are expecting him to be in the UFL, and you can get him and stop a team like DC from getting him. That's a good selection. Now, Jaden Janke, currently on the Texans, is where it gets a bit weirder in a sense that you're double dipping in the wide receiver. Again, somebody who was solid at SDSU, 2,800 yards in the 4 years he actually played receiver there. Overall was a solid player, 30 total TDs receiving. This is somebody who I definitely think could be a really good receiver in the UFL, but again, it's double dipping in a position you really don't need to. Again, even if some of your wide receivers don't return next year, you already had 4 great ones. So if 2 of them don't return, it's not like it's that big a deal. So, I don't know. I think it's a solid pick in some ways. Kind of feels like you're kind of hurting other teams more than helping your own, though. That's just my thoughts, is what it is. Now, their 9th round pick was Miles Sims, cornerback out of Georgia Tech. Not really against this one. Cornerback, if you were to really... there really wasn't that many weaknesses on the team. DBs, it's always good to help those get better. When you look at him, he does have, almost 40 tackles a year the last 2 years at Georgia Tech. Had 1 TFL each year, had an interception both years. So can't really be too upset about this. Again, it's an understandable pick, helping shore up the back end on your defense. It's a solid selection. Again, can't really be too mad about it. Decent one. And then they double down at cornerback with Miles Jones for the last pick. Again, doubling down, smart decision. Talked about it before, you can get multiple guys to help you. Solid pick. Currently, he's on the Jets. He is coming out of Duke, a big 6'4" guy. Now, when you look at him statistically, he didn't do a ton statistically the last couple of years, but that's also because he didn't really play a lot of games. When you date back his last full year at Texas A&M, he actually put up really good numbers, 29 total tackles, 2 TFLs, and 2 interceptions. Then in 8 games in 2020, he had even more tackles, but also had an interception. But then he only played 2 games, 1 game, 4 games. So somebody who has had concerns in injury side and playing side. But if he's on the Jets, it's because people do think, hey, this guy could be really solid. So again, solid pick overall, decent while you're double dipping at the position. Now their draft grade is going to be B+. I can't really put them at A or higher. I just don't think they did enough to deserve that in a sense. I think a double dipping at wide receiver was questionable. I would have liked to see at least 1 more offensive lineman selected. Again, there's not really too much to be upset about. It's just that, do I think this was better than the Renegades draft? No. Do I think it was a good draft? Yes. I think there's a couple players that they could have gotten better options had they selected guys in a different area. I think Bradley Ashmore is a perfect example. That's a solid selection, but I think there were better offensive linemen that you could have drafted before and even afterwards. So because of that, I'm going to put it at that grade. Again, it's a B+. It's not like I'm saying they did a bad job. I just think that they could have done better. Hey guys, Zom Fox here, and today it is time to do the third to last 2024 UFL College Draft team recap, and we're going to be doing the Michigan Panthers today. The Michigan Panthers were the only other team to miss out in the championship game that made the playoffs naturally with the Battlehawks, but thanks to them beating them in week 1, they ended up getting the pick after them. So, while it did hurt them in a bit, the fact is the Panthers had a really good season this past year. They really didn't have many weaknesses on their roster. The issue was mainly injuries. Frank Gidna, Wes Hills, basically every quarterback getting hurt at different points in the season hurt them. And while they gave the Stallions a run for their money, in the end they weren't able to beat them. And so that's why they're picking 6th instead of 7th or 8th. Now, with them, there's a lot of things where it's also hard to say exactly what they need. They really didn't have a ton of weaknesses. Again, as we talked about the Battlehawks last time, and we will talk about, when you're in these playoff teams, there's really not much to say that we're bad about a team. So it's more like getting just the best talent rather than getting just, positions in need. So again, if you end up enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. We still have 2 more teams to do. And without further ado, let's get started with their first round pick and the 6th overall pick, Julian Pearl, offensive tackle out of Illinois. Again, solid selection. This is like DC, you're making a huge move. You're getting an offensive lineman in the first round. Now, at Illinois, he played in 11 games all the last 3 years and higher in 2023. He was or is currently on the Ravens. You're getting an offensive lineman to help you out. Again, this is very similar. The first pick they had in the 2023 USFL College Draft was Jarrett Horst, an offensive lineman. They understand that offensive line is going to help them. And if you were to put any position as a weakness for them, it would probably be the offensive line, which wasn't all that great all year. So again, selecting an offensive lineman first round, I think that's a really smart decision. I think that overall it's a good pick. I think that, again, you could argue that some linemen are better than others, but I think that at the end of the day, you got one that you wanted clearly. That's why you drafted him in the first round. Not really too upset about this. Solid selection. Now, your second round pick was Dwight McLaughlin, cornerback out of Arkansas. Now, when you look at him, he's currently on the Vikings. He was a second-team All-SEC back in 2022. Now, he has played 4 years. He's kind of one of your classic college football players, freshman that didn't play a ton, then sophomore, saw more action, then junior and senior seasons. His sophomore or junior season was definitely his best, 52 total tackles, 4 interceptions. But this last year, while he had 30 less tackles, he did have 3 TFLs and 3 interceptions despite playing 4 less games. When you look at him, again, he helps you out. Cornerback was not as good as safety, I think a lot of people would say, just because of the talent he had at safety. But again, both their DB positions were, not the worst in the league. They were both solid. But again, you're helping that back end. I think this is a solid selection for that reason. Again, it's just like the Battlehawks. There's really not much you can do that's wrong unless you draft in a position that's super strong multiple times. So again, just like the Battlehawks, is one of the selections, just a solid selection. You got a good player to help you out. Good decision. Now, their third round pick was Isaac Okwu. Now, when you look at him, Isaac is one of those guys who's a defensive end out of Ole Miss. Again, he is back to that, you're drafting to a position that you're good at. Now, while they're not like omega deep, they are pretty deep in defensive line, not super deep. So this is a guy that can help you out there. Now, in James Madison, he had 7.5 sacks in the Sun Belt Conference in 2022. Then he went to Ole Miss. He had 3.5 sacks, 4.5 TFLs. So even though he went to tougher competition, he still put up good numbers, just not as good as he did at James Madison, but still good numbers. He is currently on the Detroit Lions. Naturally, Michigan Panthers, Detroit Lions. We saw it with Jake Bates go to the Detroit Lions. So it could be a similar story there, getting a guy that's more local. Getting local guys we talk about is always a good thing as well. The fans are more likely to know who they are. Fans are more likely to care. And of course, if the player like Isaac is already with the Lions, if he gets released, you could say, I don't really want to leave Detroit. Let's go to the Michigan Panthers. Solid selection. Now, the fourth round pick was Brian Dooley, another offensive lineman. He is from the Tennessee Titans. He played at Eastern Michigan. So yes, an EMU player. Again, Michigan, I mean, it's a smart decision. You're getting another local guy. This guy's been in Michigan for a long time now. 6 years of his life he was there. So if he doesn't, make it in the NFL, he can just go back to Michigan and play for the Panthers. Solid selection in that regard. He did play, 13 games, or basically played a full season in 4 of his 6 years at EMU in the MAC. So I think this is a really solid selection for that reason. Again, you're helping your O-line, which was your more weak area of your team. Good pick. Now, they did draft a quarterback in Rocky Lombardi in the 5th round out of MSU, Michigan State University, and Northern Illinois. This is one of those where, unlike a lot of the other quarterbacks, people were like, oh, that's a good decision. A lot of people were not too happy with the Rocky Lombardi selection. Now, statistically, it's not like he really did all that much. 11 TDs to 7 interceptions on a sub-60 completion percentage your last year in college in the MAC conference is not necessarily a good thing. Then it's not like he really played a ton at MSU, but when he did, it's not like he was incredible. 3 for 3 TD interception his freshman year. Then he was 8 to 9 in his junior year there. It's just, in terms of QBs, yeah, there were better QBs taken in this draft. I'm going to admit it. Now, he is on the Bengals, and again, it could be just some people saying he's not that great and all that. I get selecting a quarterback. You did have 4 different QBs play, which all had various degrees of hype ahead of them playing, and all ended up looking good at some point. But again, this is probably one of their weaker selections. This is one of the weaker QBs taken in the draft, a lot of people would agree with. But it's still not a terrible pick. I mean, you did see a lot of injuries happen. Who knows if everybody comes back playing? Who knows if they come back playing the same way they did last year? Not a horrid pick, but definitely not a great one. Now, their next selection was Dayton Wade in the 6th round. This was a really shocking one in a sense of getting a receiver at this point in the draft. I don't believe any other team had actually picked a receiver up until this point, which was crazy. But as for him, his last year in college, he put up 800 receiving yards with Ole Miss, 55 total receptions that year. A really solid player, all things considered. And again, you were able to get basically a first pick or wide receiver. So in that regard, it's just a good decision. He's on the Ravens currently. We'll see if he makes the roster. This is a good selection. Wide receiver, you just lost Marcus Sims to the NFL. So getting somebody else to help you in that regard is going to help you out. So, solid pick here. Now, your 7th round pick was Akeem Dent out of FSU, position safety. FSU, again, we talked about before, had a great season this past year. Some people view they got robbed from a championship game opportunity or a playoff opportunity. They played in a lot of games basically every year at FSU. This past 3 years, he was essentially the same player, which is a good thing. 44 plus tackles, 0.5 plus TFLs, and half a sack 2 different years. Really solid player, again, helps you out in your DB room. Making that area just stronger is a smart decision, so I like this pick. Now, their 8th round selection was Andrew Meyer, center or offensive lineman, out of UTEP. Now, when you look at him, this is somebody who was an All-Conference USA honorable mention a couple of years, was an academic honor roll and all that every year, so this is a smart guy and all that. He did play a lot of games and is currently on the Dolphins, but again, is somebody that's going to help you out a lot. When you look at him, again, it's another offensive lineman pick that was an area of need. Not much to say, but aside from that, it's just a good pick. Now, you picked another offensive lineman in the 9th round, another Michigan guy in Michigan State's J.D. Duplain. Now, when you look at him, this is somebody who was a letter winner, and he played 47 career games, and 42 of those were straight. Now, his 47 starts are the second most in MSU history by an O-lineman, and his 42 consecutive starts is also second in school history. So when you look at him, I mean, not much to be upset about. I mean, an honorable All Big Ten selection a bunch of times. He did graduate with a degree. But again, the most important thing is that, he played a lot at an offensive line position in Michigan. Again, somebody else who currently is not on an NFL roster. Very good shot he plays for the Michigan Panthers. Going to help their O-line. Great pick. Then their last pick was Isaiah Stallbird, linebacker / safety. When you look at what he did in his entire career, I mean, he played like Nebraska and SDSU, another SDSU selection. Had basically really solid numbers every year at SDSU. 70 tackles, 55 tackles, 80 tackles his last 3 years. 5.5, 3.5, 6.5 TFLs, and had 3 sacks his last year. A guy who, again, multiple places have had him as a linebacker. Some have had him as a safety. So if you can have a guy that can help you out in multiple areas, that's really good. Again, a solid selection. You're helping shore up that back end. Or if you want to put him at linebacker, in case Gidna comes back and needs time to, get better, saying that, Stallbird would be able to play this upcoming year. Solid selection. Now, their overall draft grade, I'm giving it an A-. I think this is basically as good as the Renegades draft. Again, just like the Renegades draft is really, the difference is I think that their questionable pick is more questionable, and that's, of course, the Rocky Lombardi selection. I think that all in all, I think their draft overall, when you look at the amount of good selections, I think it's better than Arlington, but the one that wasn't a good selection is a very questionable one, right? The Rocky Lombardi selection is just a really weird one. Again, you had 4 QBs play well for you. This is not DC who, failed to see action, or Arlington who just didn't get a chance to. With Michigan, you had multiple guys get action. So you're saying let's draft a QB when the odds that you don't have 2 of these guys, whether it be Perkins and Etling, whether it be Perkins and Perry, you're going to have 2 of those guys at least next year. So I think that was a very questionable selection. That drags them down from an A or an A+ to an A-. Because of that selection, I think the other picks are solid. So all in all, A-. Hey guys, Fox here, and today it is time to do one of the last 2 2024 UFL College Draft team recaps in the San Antonio Brahmas, the team that made it to the championship game but did not come out of the game as champion. Now the Brahmas are a weird team. A lot of people thought they weren't going to be that good this year. just like the Panthers, but ended up making it to the title game. Now, even though they made it to the title game and did ultimately lose it, a lot of people would agree on a total sense of roster construction that they are the weakest of the 4 teams that made the playoffs. With that being said, they still don't really have that many weaknesses. It's just that they don't have as many strengths as teams like the Battlehawks, Panthers, and Stallions do. So in terms of what they wanted to do in the draft, there are actually a bit more options to do rather than the Panthers and Battlehawks, which more or less were trying to shore up like one area, and that's pretty much it. So it's going to be interesting. So again, if you end up enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified as soon as I upload the last one, as the last one will be coming out later today. So without further ado, let's get started with their first pick and the 7th overall pick in Gabe Hall, defensive tackle out of Baylor. Now Hall is currently with the Philadelphia Eagles. During his college career, he played his entire time at Baylor. And overall, I mean, his last 3 years where he saw the most action, he put up some decent numbers, but really it was his second to last year. We had 37 total tackles, 5.5 TFLs, and 4.5 sacks was his best season, arguably. Or it was his second sophomore season where he had 7 TFLs and 6 sacks. Essentially, this is somebody who definitely can be a really solid guy up front. The Brahmas were heavily carried by a great defense this past year, and so getting somebody like a Gabe Hall who could potentially join the team at some point, who is one of those big body guys that's going to help you out a lot, is a good thing. Again, as a defensive tackle, having like 5.5, TFLs, 7 TFLs, or having 4.5 plus sacks, that's a really solid number for a defensive tackle. I mean, we've seen it, back in 2023 with Keontae Schott having a bunch of sacks. It really helped the Breakers' defense look good. Because when you have a defensive tackle that's putting up sacks, it's going to do a lot of damage to the opposing team, in a sense that you have somebody else that's actually threatening you rather than just your defensive ends. So this is a really solid pick. I think this is a good first-round pick for them. Now, their second-round pick was an actual edge rusher, this time in Gabriel Murphy, who is currently on the Minnesota Vikings. Now, as for Murphy, he played at North Texas and UCLA, his 3 seasons at North Texas, and then his couple years at UCLA. Now, overall, he played 26 games at UCLA, had 76 tackles, 20 for loss, and 9.5 sacks. Those are some really solid numbers to put up in just 26 games. And of course, in 2023, he put career highs in TFLs and sacks at 16 and 8, which is really solid overall. That was 6th in the Pac-12 in sacks per game. So the fact is, this is somebody who can, rush the QB really well. Again, he's doing this to the Pac-12, which, granted the Pac-12 has been, kind of going down and down to where nowadays it's the Pac-2, but the point is, it's still a really impressive thing that he was able to pull off at UCLA. So this is somebody who, if he doesn't make the Minnesota Vikings roster, gets called up somewhere, he's going to help out a lot in the Brahmas front pass rush, because again, this is a great player to edge rush. So essentially, these top 2 picks are both very similar. Now yes, one of them is interior and one is outside D-line, but they're both still D-line who both are able to get to the quarterback. These aren't just guys who, are good at getting tackles, guys who are just, good at being those disruptive guys. These are guys who can actually get to the QB or the running back when they're, still in the backfield. So when you have these type of guys, those are the kind of guys that can make your defense insanely terrifying. Just think back to the 2022 Houston Gamblers, where that defensive line, mainly helmed by Chris Odom, was just a nightmare to play against. So when you have something like this, it's a good thing. I also really like this pick. Now the next selection was offensive tackle Donovan Jennings. Now again, as I always talk about in all these, offensive line is the position you want to draft the most of. It's hard to get good O-linemen. Drafting as many as you can gives you the best shot at getting them to play for you and that they're going to be good. Now, he is currently on the Packers. Overall, he played 55 games and made 45 starts, which is up there in school history for USF. Overall, there's not much to say aside from the fact that this is another offensive line selection. You could argue there were some guys better. You can argue that some guys weren't. This is somebody who's currently on as an offensive guard / tackle for the Packers, but that was drafted as a tackle. If he's able to transition to play both, that can be huge, especially in a league where you only have so many roster spots open. So, good selection again. Now, their 4th pick was Miles Battle, cornerback out of Utah. He is currently on the Kansas City Chiefs. He only saw really 3 years of true action, 2 of them being at Ole Miss and 1 at Utah. And overall, he put up similar numbers in interception all 3 of his last seasons. He had at least 3 passes deflected or defended in his last 3 years. And when you look at him, it's a solid pick to get. Cornerback, help shore up your back end. It's another smart decision. Again, the defense wasn't the weakness of this Brahmas team. The defense was actually really good. Even in the championship game, it actually did enough to win. It was more so the offense did nothing. So at this point, I would say that through the 4 rounds, I think they're doing solid. It's just that you kind of would hope they would draft more offensive talent. But Miles Battle, solid selection. Now, their 5th round pick was another defensive lineman, this time in defensive end. Jean-Marie Croma. Now, he comes out of JMU, and overall he also played at Rutgers. Now, what he pulled off were some, again, great numbers at getting to the quarterback. So they're not drafting these guys, again, for just, different reasons. These are all guys for the edge rushers and defensive linemen that get to the quarterback. In the Sun Belt and JMU, he had 10 sacks and 19 TFLs his last season there. That is some really solid numbers. Again, if you're able to translate that even somewhat to the UFL's 10-game schedule, if you were to get, instead of 10 sacks, like let's say 6 sacks in a 10-game season, you're doing something right. Just like if you were able to somehow get like 10 TFLs, that's a great season. So if he's able to translate some of that to what he did at JMU, if he, ends up not making the Bears roster and all that, that would be huge. So again, this is another decision where you're drafting somebody that's very similar to the other guys, which makes sense, right? It's like I've talked about, double dipping. You can't say for certain that these guys are going to play for you at any point in the future. But if you draft multiple guys that do very similar things, either A, they're going to synergize really well because they both pass rush the QB, or B, only one of them comes into the team, but you drafted 2 of them, so you kind of expected at least one of them to. So I like this pick in a sense that it makes sense with everybody else. Just that, again, you're kind of not, hammering the area you really need. Now, they start doing that in the 6th round with Leadertrick Griffin. Now, when you look at Griffin, he is a wide receiver out of Mississippi State. Now, this is one of the positions they do need. Yes, their receiving core is better than I expected it to be, but it still left a little bit to be desired. And naturally, tight end is the big one. Cody Latimer said it was going to be his last year. Is it because of the injury? We don't know for sure, but get to that a bit later. As for Griffin, the more important thing is this is also a kick return type of guy, somebody who can actually be used as a kick returner. In college, 3 of his 4 years, he actually averaged over 30 yards a kick return, which is really incredible. Especially that 19 return season with 613 yards. He's had 2 return touchdowns in college, and while his last season he dipped to 22. Again, most of his college career he was having really good, returns. So hopefully that can translate well if he does go to, the UFL, because again, they're potentially going to change the kickoff again, but if not, who knows. Now, as a receiver, he also put up a couple decent years his last 2 years at Mississippi State. 500 yards and 650 yards, 4 TDs both times. Over 12 yards of reception. This is a guy who was a great returner, one of the best returners in college football for a little bit. Really solid player. This is a selection I really do like. You're getting somebody who can either help you out as a kick returner or as a wide receiver. Good pick. Now, their 7th round pick was Boo Braid, safety out of Maryland. Again, another defensive back selection, right? They picked a cornerback earlier, now you're picking a safety. Currently on the Ravens, played his whole career at Maryland. At Maryland, he put some really solid tackle numbers. 85 tackles his second to last year, 75 his last year. 3 total interceptions those last 2 years, and he had 8 TFLs the last 2 years as well. And he also had 11 passes defended his last 2 years and forced 3 fumbles. So this is a really solid safety to get. This is one of those guys who, again, if he can translate to the UFL, will translate really well. Is a really solid player to get for this team. And again, you're going, double dip. And while it's not the same corner and safety, you're still double dipping in the DB room. Smart decision, like it, just still questionable on how you're not dealing with a couple of weaknesses on your roster. Now, their 8th round pick was Sincere Haynesworth. Now, when you look at Haynesworth, center out of Tulane, again, you're going back to the offensive line. He was a 2-time first-team All-AAC with Tulane. Now, of course, the AAC also had a lot of changes, the last couple of years. But as for him, he's currently on the Saints. Again, it's another one of those solid ones. He's not like a huge center, 6'1", still a big guy. And overall, when you look at it, center is a hugely important position on the offensive line. And again, you're getting some more help up there. Smart decision, good pick. Now, their 9th round pick was DJ Miller Jr., Kent State cornerback. Now, he is currently on the Kansas City Chiefs, at Iowa State and Kent State. He really didn't see much time in Iowa, but as Kent State, he did have over 100 tackles his last 2 years combined. He only had 1 TFL, no sacks, 1 interception, so he wasn't one of those, corners that also does a lot of other stuff. He was mainly just a cornerback. 7 passes defended, 2 fumble recoveries. Not much to say here. Again, you're getting another one of, a cornerback. Some people would argue they don't really need to draft a lot of them. Some would say it's a smart decision. It is what it is. Now, their 10th round pick was Josh Rosephus. Now, when you look at Josh, wide receiver out of UTSA, was a first-team All-AAC, was a second-team All-Conference USA back in, 2022, because, UTSA changed conferences and all that. When you look at him, his last 3 years, he put up great numbers all 3 years, 800, 1,000, and 1,150. Now, especially when you see him go from the Conference USA to putting up 1,000 yards to putting up 1,150 in the AAC, that's impressive. Yes, that AAC was missing some of the other big boys that it used to have, but it's still, a lot of people would say, is one of the best, non-Power 5, or hell, some would argue it would be kind of the fifth conference now, with the Pac-12 being the Pac-2. The point is, he was able to go to a different conference that was better than what he was in and still put up really good numbers. And he had 10 TDs his last season. This is somebody who definitely can be a really solid threat on this team, and you can argue that was a steal getting him in the 10th round. I think it's a really good pick. I mean, this dude is 6'2", 190, so this is a big guy. So this is a really good pick. Now, their overall draft grade, I'm going to be giving it a B+. Why a B+? Well, I really can't say I dislike many of their selections. It's just that I wouldn't have drafted cornerbacks when you have a massive need at tight end, essentially because of the fact that Cody Latimer might retire. Again, he said he was gonna. Did that change when he got hurt? But also, you didn't draft a quarterback. They're the only team that somehow had every quarterback at some point in the season just lose stock in them. Now, Chase Garbers had his stock rise, and then it plummeted at the end of the year, especially with that championship game performance. Quentin Dormady had a bunch of hype, and he proved to be not that guy. And then Kevin Hogan played like one drive, and that's basically it. So you should have drafted a quarterback, and you should have drafted a tight end. Right? We saw other teams draft quarterbacks just because of the threat that their quarterback is going to retire or not come back to the league. Whereas the Brahmas, who have that threat at tight end, didn't draft a tight end, despite there being some good ones there. And then, of course, you have another issue in the sense that you didn't draft a quarterback, despite you desperately needing to. Other teams drafted quarterbacks that just didn't need to. The Panthers didn't need to, and they did. The Defenders did not need the draft too, and they did that. It was stupid, but they did it. The Brahmas didn't. So because of that, I can't give them an A-. They did not have a draft that was as good as teams that had an A- or better, but it was still a good draft, so I'm going to give it a B+. Hey guys, Fox here, and today it is time to do the final 2024 UFL College Draft team recap in the Birmingham Stallions. The Birmingham Stallions pulled off the three-peat, winning their third straight spring football championship this past season, and in terms of their draft, it's one of those where they basically don't need to draft any sort of position. Their team was really loaded, whether it be having two great quarterbacks, a solid wide receiver and tight end room, one of the best, if not the best, offensive line, a defense that really had no super weakness, even a decent special teams unit, barring injuries. This is a team that pretty much had the luxury of drafting whatever they thought was best. So if you end up enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. I've done all 8 of these, and I'll have a Supercut version coming out later this week. So without further ado, let's get started with the first round pick and the 8th overall pick in Frank Crum, tackle out of Wyoming. Now, Crum was a first team and third team All Mountain West player. He went from third team to first team in his second to last and last year at Wyoming, and he is currently on the Broncos. Big tackle, 6'7" guy. When you look at him, all that you really have to say is that this is, the start of a good selection for the Stallions. Look, the Stallions know that offensive line is a position that you always have to keep refilling on. You have to keep drafting guys who might come to you next year, might come to you in like 3 years. You never know with these college drafts where it's about rights and not exactly the player actually playing for you. So you have to hope they come to the league, but essentially, if you can draft as many as you can, you'll never have a terrible offensive line. The Stallions understand that. This is a really smart selection for the first round. Got a really solid tackle early, good selection. Now, their second pick was Lorenzo Thompson, another tackle. He is currently on the Browns. He was, a third-team All-American from Phil Steele. He was an All-Conference or All-CAA first team and third team in his second to last and last year there. And again, it's a solid selection. You just double-dipped at tackle. Why? You don't know for sure if one of these guys is going to play for you this next season or even in 2 years. You draft 2 of them, there's a better shot that one of them comes to the team in the next couple of years. They both can help you out really well on that offensive line. Continue making your strength a strength. Smart decision. It's a great draft pick. Now, their third pick was Amani Bailey. Now, you look at Bailey, he is currently on the Chiefs. He was at TCU in Louisiana. Now, in Louisiana, he put up, one season where he had 642 yards on the ground, 150 through the air. But it was his last season at TCU where he, really broke out. 1,200 yards on 220 carries. That's a 5.4 yards per attempt. 8 rushing TDs, 184 yards receiving, and a receiving touchdown. That's 9 total TDs, and that's 1,393 scrimmage yards on a 5.6 overall yards per play. I mean, that's a really solid pick. Again, yes, the Stallions have great running backs. Ricky Person and CJ Maribel are great. You don't know for sure if they're going to be back next year because of, NFL stuff and all that happening. But the point is, again, you're kind of getting, some solace in the future. You hate to say it, but how often can CJ Maribel be that guy? Is he going to at some point start slowing down and have only a couple games where he can be that guy? Is he just going to, stop playing or something? You never know for sure. So getting somebody that can be a potential replacement if he doesn't make it in the NFL is a smart decision. Again, Bailey put up some good numbers his last year at TCU in the Big 12. So I actually like this pick a lot. Really solid one. Now, their 4th-round pick was Isaiah Williams, one of the very first receivers taken, one of the first 2. He played his whole career at Illinois, currently on the Detroit Lions. His last year, he was a first-team All-Big Ten, but the important thing to note about him is that this is somebody who can actually play pretty much anything you really need him to. In a sense that this is somebody who was a QB the first couple years at Illinois. Now, he didn't have a ton of time out there, but again, he threw the ball 63 times, not for good numbers, but, 393 yards, only threw 2 interceptions to 4 TDs, but a 41 completion percentage is horrific. But the point is, he can be a quarterback. Now, since he was a quarterback, he did have some experience running the ball. He had almost 400 yards rushing that second year as a quarterback. Now, as a receiver, he put up some great numbers. Now, it went better and better. His first year as a receiver, he had 500 yards. Then it was 700. Then it was 1,000. Now, what was more impressive is his receptions went from 47 to 82 and 82 again. But his second to last and last year, you saw his yards per reception go up by 4, which is a really solid number. He put up 4 TDs or 5 in every one of his 3 seasons there. And important to note, he also is a punt returner the last couple of years. 16 and 11 returns. And again, you saw improvement. You saw 7.5 yards per return to 11.5. So this is somebody who, in theory, could be a emergency QB, could be an emergency running back, who could be your legit punt returner or your legit receiver. That's a big thing. And of course, the Lions probably see that as well, hence why he's currently a UDFA on the team. But if he comes to the Stallions, this is one of those guys who can make some huge impact plays for Birmingham and do a lot of stuff, including trick plays. Really good selection. Now, their next selection was Dallin Holker, tight end out of Colorado State. This is where we see one of the couple of big selections by the Stallions. They don't need a tight end, but if they get him, that's big. His last year, he was a second-team All-American, first-team All-Mountain West, and he was at Colorado State and put up some damn good numbers. 760 yards receiving as a tight end in college is big. 6 TDs, 64 receptions, incredible numbers. Especially since at BYU, he wasn't putting up the same insane numbers. But his last year at Colorado State, he really went to be, that guy. And this is somebody who kind of feels like was one of those selections where he kind of hurt a couple other teams. This is a player I wouldn't have been shocked to see the Brahmas or Panthers select. And the fact that they took him, the Stallions, that's huge. This is somebody who, if he does come to the league, can be a really solid player for them. This is a great selection. You don't need him, but if you do get him, it's just upgrading an already good position. Smart pick. Now, their 6th-round pick was Trajan Jeffcoat, defensive end, out of Arkansas. Now, when you look at him, he was a first-team All-SEC back in 2020, where he had 6 sacks, 23 total tackles in 8 games. Now, he never replicated that level of success in a sack perspective. Even in a tackle perspective, while he had 34 the next year, he played in 5 more games, so it's not really like it was that impressive. And his last year in Arkansas, he didn't really rebound there either. He just did in sacks where he had 4 of them. But again, this is somebody who is currently on the Saints, who does have a higher likelihood than a lot of the other guys we talked about on actually, making it to the Stallions at some point. So all in all, I think this is a solid selection. This is so far one of, if not their weakest selection at this point in the draft. And if this is the worst guy you picked, this is a lot of other teams is like, mid-pick, like their 5th best pick. If this is the worst pick the Stallions had, is this guy, man, they had a good draft. Now, their 7th-round pick was Andrew Coker, another tackle out of TCU. You drafted a TCU running back. If you were able to get him and Coker, that's huge. That's synergy. That's 2 guys that have already played together, already know each other's, patterns and everything, how they play, and that's huge. Now, he's currently on the Raiders, but he did play 3 years as a legit starter, really 4 for TCU. But again, you drafted a TCU running back, now you're drafting one of his offensive linemen. Again, now you're triple dipping at the tackle position. You're basically saying we are going to have one of these guys next year. And again, if you're able to get both RB and tackle together, that's huge. Really good selection here. Now, their 8th-round pick was Amarion Brown, wide receiver out of USC, University of South Carolina. Now, and he also played at Georgia Tech, but at USC with Brown, he put up numbers. Okay, it's not like he got a ton of receptions, But when you look at his whole career, I mean, his best year was arguably his first year in college, where he had 21 receptions for 396 yards and 7 TDs. His last year, he had 265 yards and 26 receptions with 1 TD. But he did miss 4 games. If he had had those 4 games, he would have put up his second best season for sure, instead of being arguably his second best season. So there's something to be desired there. Again, he is currently on the Browns, so there is some potential in him. But again, this is somebody who definitely can help the Stallions if he does go to the team. He can be one of those, backup receivers, or, one of those like third or fourth options. Not a bad pick. Not a super good one, but not a bad pick. Again, this is a pick that if other teams had made it, we'd be talking about it in a much better light. So, again, just shows how important this draft is. Really not for the Stallions in some sense. So, yeah. Now, their second to last pick is Sam Hartman. This is the pick where when I saw this, I was like, wow, that's good. Sam Hartman feels like one of those that a lot of teams probably didn't draft for the sole reason that they don't expect him to actually play for them. Yes, he was a UDFA, but he's one of those guys that very much can be that guy that will always stick around. He is up there in like so many Wake Forest record books, hell, even FBS record books, he's up there in like the top 20 in so many stats. He had 15,600 yards passing in his career. I mean, yes, he was basically a starter every year in college since 2018, minus 2019, where he only played a couple games. He was a second-team All-ACC in 2021, and then 2022 he was third team. But again, his numbers, it's not like he was throwing for insane completion percentage, but a 64 as his best, or 63.5 is still really good. And he was putting up good TD interception ratio, 134 to 49. He also had 1,000 career rushing yards pretty much and 20 rushing TDs. So he had a season where he put up, 50 TDs totals. 39 through the air, 11 on the ground. This is somebody who very well could go to the Stallions in, let's say, 4 years if he's not in the NFL, and then be their future quarterback in like 4 years. This is the exact type of pick the Stallions need to make. This is getting somebody who, if he never comes to you, does not matter. You're still fine without getting somebody else here. But if he does go to the team in a few years, oh my god. It's like when the Breakers, drafted like Tyler Scott, I believe, if I remember correctly, in the 2023 college draft. You knew he was getting drafted in the NFL in like the first 4 rounds. But it's that potential of if he doesn't stay in the NFL, you're getting a super speed demon to play for you. It's very similar to that regard for the Stallions here with Hartman. This is somebody who could be a legit QB1 for a UFL team and be one of the best QBs there. I mean, there were a lot of games in Wake Forest where he was pretty much carrying that team. The Demon Deacons did not have that good a defense for some of those years. So I think this is one of the best picks of the entire draft for that reason, across any team. Now, their last pick was Ethan Driscoll, another tackle. He is currently on the Chiefs, played 47 games in college. Not much to say, but again, a solid selection. This is their 4th tackle they drafted this draft. The odds of at least one of these guys playing for the team next year are insanely high. The odds 2 of them do are pretty high. That's why you do this. You make sure you can shore up an offensive line, which is the hardest position in spring football to actually have a good group in. Incredible. Now, their draft grade is an A+. I cannot be mad at really anything. Their 2 worst picks were picks that other teams would be dying for, in a sense. Yes, you can argue they didn't need to draft 4 offensive linemen. I would actually argue that that's what they should do. See, when you're a team that's elite, you do things that other people question, but are what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to invest heavily in the offensive line in this draft. You're supposed to take a risk or 2 in players who might not ever play for you, but if they do. You're supposed to get guys who are just the best player available. That's what it felt like. It felt like the Stallions at certain points in the draft said, you know what? Let's just get the best player available. Getting a great tight end. Getting a quarterback that's just a college football, and you could argue a college football legend despite really never winning anything, like never making it to a playoff or anything. The point is, this was a great draft. There's really nothing I can be that upset about. I mean, the only thing you could argue is like, maybe instead of getting a receiver at one point, you get like, I don't know, a corner or something, but even then it's like the team was just loaded. So I really don't think so. I think the Stallions looked at this draft, said, you know what, we really don't have a weakness. Let's just shore up an area that could become a weakness in the offensive line. Let's get some guys that could help us out in the future. All in all, again, incredible draft, A+. So that'll do it. This has been Zom Fox. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Again, I will have the Supercut version with all 8 of these videos together coming out probably like in the next couple days. So be on the lookout for that. think about becoming a channel member for 99 cents a month to get exclusive video every month as well as a bunch of other benefits. And as always, guys, have a great night.